Hey everybody, welcome to the second tutorial in the last week of our mixing class. This is the final week of our course, and in this video, which is the second part of 3, we will be focusing on EQ. Now we're going to focus on EQ in two forms, and it's really the only two forms that regularly show up in mixing, namely sculpting, which is where we take EQ and use that to shape the sound of an instrument. So we might add brightness, or we might cut ranges of the frequencies that are a little foggy, but we massage the sound so that it fits better with the overall mix. Note that I said fits better with the overall mix, not just sounds better on its own. That's really critical. Then the second thing that we're going to do a lot with EQ, and that we'll demonstrate today with the bass and the drum set, is a technique called unmasking, which is where we take problematic, busy frequencies where a lot of information is being held, such as the 300 hertz range, which is a really noisy end of the low end, and we're going to clear that up by removing things from that range that aren't needed. So once again, sculpting, where we shape an instrument, and unmasking, where we get rid of things that get in the way of sounds that really need to be in certain ranges. Let's switch over to Reaper and take a look at a few key examples. All right, right now I've already got the acoustic guitar queued up. I've got an EQ loaded. If you'd like to follow along, I recommend doing the same thing. All you need to do is click in one of the open slots on your mixer. And you can do that up here, by the way, too, if you don't have enough screen space. And then under the Reaper plugin library, just start, we want to search for EQ, not comp. And then we're going to pick the same EQ we used during the previous week to filter out unwanted noise. So we have this I can't speak, RIA EQ this morning. I'm not going to add one as I already have one in place, but you're welcome to add one and follow along. Let's take a brief look at some of the more advanced controls of EQ. So when we first looked at this, we basically did everything with a high shelf, not a high shelf, a low pass and a high pass filter. Low pass lets low end of the frequency go through. As the name suggests, it lets all the lows pass through. High pass lets all the highs pass through. But you'll notice there's several other options in here. The critical ones that we're really going to spend time with are the band, which is what most of these are going to be, and then the shelves, which are up here at the top and the very top. Shelves raise a boost or a cut that once you've determined where it is, it extends all the way to the high or the low end based on whether it's a high or a low shelf. So it literally builds a little shelf. Band creates a bump or a trough. These are very specific tools that each have different ways of targeting things, and we're going to use a little bit of all of them on this acoustic guitar. So I currently have all of the bands disabled. You'll see that on this enabled thing is unchecked. That means they're in place, but none of them are actually creating any sound. And then this checkbox up here disables the entire plugin. So when I click this, you'll see it says bypassed up here. So it'll have no effect on the sound. So we get to hear what it actually sounds like, and we'll do that in just a moment. Let's talk about a couple of these others. Frequency is probably pretty obvious, but just to be clear, this is the frequency center point. That's right where this little node is that's affecting that specific range. So if I say 108.0 hertz, then what that is towards the very bottom end, right around 108 hertz, in fact, exactly on 108 hertz, that's where all the activity is going to take place. It's going to center the EQ around that. Gain is how intense of whatever we're doing is going to happen. In the purposes of this EQ, it's basically how above or below this blue line we're going to be, which is how much cut, which we can see over here by -6, or how much raise, which we can boost, which we can see by the +6 here. So it just gives you an idea how far we can go. Reaper is very generous with this and allows you to go quite far in either direction. Last off, bandwidth, which is often called Q in a lot, literally the letter Q in a lot of programs, determines how broad a cut we're talking about. So when we're talking about bandwidth, if bandwidth is very narrow, we'll have just a tiny little point we're affecting. Whereas if the bandwidth is very wide, we might have a very, very wide alteration of the sound. We'll play around with a little bit of that as we're working on this, so you'll get to see all this in action. You can also add, in Reaper, you can add a ton of bands to this. I actually haven't played around to find out if there's a limit. I've rarely found the need for more than 5 or 6, and 5 or 6 is fairly extreme. Usually the basic 4 points is all I need. But if you ever find yourself needing more, simply click that. It puts another note on the screen. All right, and you can also turn off some of the visuals, but that just really isn't that important right now. There are presets up here. We're not going to be using any of these, but you can see it's got a lot of the basic instruments we'd mess with, and it's just ways to get, I guess, a certain goal a lot quicker, and then you can tweak what comes up. But we just don't need to worry about any of this right now. So let's go ahead and listen to what our acoustic guitar sounds like. So it's a perfectly good sounding acoustic guitar. But a couple things worth noting. It's a little bit dull, maybe. Kind of an uninteresting part. It's got a lot of bottom end. If you listen to the bottom, the bass actually goes down quite far. When you put all this together, the result is the acoustic guitar tends to hide in the mix. Let's unsolo for a moment and hear what it sounds like in the mix.
And you know, with me, and you could.
See, it doesn't really have much it can add short of boosting it really loud in volume so that it sits on top of the mix. And hopefully you're observing that this part is not a focal point. This part is very much an accompaniment. It just sits behind the vocal. So what we want to do is we want to find a way to sculpt the tone. And we're going to use sculpting EQ techniques to do that. So let's start working on the low end. First things first, I decided I wanted to get rid of the very boomy bottom end of the guitar. So I've enabled a low cut. Let's listen to what that does. It's fairly subtle, but listen to the very bottom, the bassy end of the range. It just lightens it up a little. There, it's back out again, and back in again. You'll see on the graph, it's not getting rid of the frequencies, it's just squishing them down. All right, the second point is dealing with a muddy range of most instruments. This is sitting right around 300 hertz, and when I check that, I just pulled a little bit of that out of there. This one's really subtle, but let me toggle it back and forth so you can hear it. This is off. This is on. It's very subtle. If you're not hearing it, I completely understand. But all it's doing is pulling some of the cloudiness out of the very bottom of the instrument. Let's go over to the third point. So notice that this is right around the middle of the 1,000 to 2,000 range. So we're going to be about 1,400, I believe. Let's double check it. 1,300. Okay. This is right around, well, we often like to refer to this as sort of a power zone for the low mids. What this does is it pushes forward the attack. It pushes forward the brilliance of the low end. So we've scooped out a lot of the lows, but we have some left. And for me, this is going to accentuate the picking sounds. Let's check it out. So here the pick is coming through more clean. There's sort of a chiminess. So this is out. Back in. So we just hear more of the pick. Again, subtle, but not so subtle to my ear because I know exactly what I'm listening for. Hopefully you start to hear it better and better as we go. This is a good place where we can play with the Q for a moment. So right now we have a fairly wide Q, but if I go wider, we can catch a lot more frequencies. Now I don't think that's helping us. It added some warmth, but it also added some cloudiness. So I like this a little bit lower. I think we're in the 1.3 range. I even like it right around 1.5. What we're listening for is just, we're only getting the frequencies we really want. We could make this very narrow if we wanted to. And now it's isolating a very specific frequency. But for our purposes, a little bit of a broader boost is wise. Okay, last but not least, we're going to use a high shelf. The point of the high shelf is the acoustic guitar isn't punching through because it doesn't have a personality of its own. It's sort of existing in the same space with the horns and with the cymbals and with the other guitars and so on. So I'm going to raise up the high frequencies, and we're adding a lot of air and shine to the sound. Here's out, here's in. Now, it can be argued that I've significantly changed the sound of the acoustic guitar, and I really have. I've made it a lot thinner, I've made it a lot brighter. You might not want your acoustic guitar to sound like this, except with this EQ now in the track, it has a personality. Let's check it out in the context of the song. It's very subtle.
And see, then you'd know. Love with me.
Pull the EQ out.
And you
And now it's basically gone.
could be so.
I'll put it back in.
Brand new if you
Just hear a little bit of the picking.
look and see.
Gone again.
Then you'd know.
Back
Love
in.
with me
And here, I'm going to push it forward in the texture a bit so you can just hear it a bit more.
could be so.
The chiminess,
Brand new if
I think that's a bit much for my tastes, but it's nice.
and
Okay, so this is the concept of sculpting EQ. We can do this really with any instrument. And the goal here is twofold. It's to make the instrument more what it's doing in the mix, and it's to get rid of the unnecessary, to get things out of the way of other stuff. Now, I've done this with several tracks. Let's check out just samples of what we've done. So this is the chorused guitar. I'm going to solo that so you can hear the difference. I pretty much treated this the same way as our acoustic. So right now I've got the EQ off. It's not unlike our acoustic in sound, but it had the same problems. It's a little dull, it's a little dead. Turning it on, I just put a little bit of a boost around 800. That gave it a bit more bite, and then I gave it some air, just like we did with the acoustic guitar. Okay? Let's see what else we did over here with the keyboards. So let's solo our keyboard part right here. And then the same basic concept. Here's its default sound. And I just wanted it to be a little bit more robust. So I added a substantial boost around the same 800 range and then cut the mud out of it. It thins out the sound, but it also cleared a lot of room for the bass down here. Okay? These are relatively subtle changes, and honestly, if you're making huge changes, you're probably inflicting problems on yourself. Let's take a check, listen to the vocal. Let's see, we'll go right here.
and you.
There's nothing inherently
could
wrong with
be
this singer's voice.
so.
But what I wanted to do
Brand
is give him a
new
little
if
bit more
you
punch.
Just look and see.
So I gave him a bit of air,
Then you'd know.
and I gave him some extra muscle in this
with
range here.
me,
Between 1 and 2, you get a lot of power without adding brightness.
Could be so.
Off.
Brand new if
And
you
on.
just look
Notice the clarity, it punches through now.
and see.
All right, what else do we have? Let's see. Okay, we have the bass. The bass and the drums are kind of a special case, so why don't we look at them together? So I have a drum bus EQ. Notice that I've put it on the percussion folder rather than individual tracks, and I've done a lot. I'm going to go ahead and leave it disabled for the moment, and then I've got the bass. I'm going to draw your attention to a couple things. First off, let's look at the sculpting elements. So the percussion, I've added the same airiness. I've also added a bump up here that we'll talk about in a moment, but it's really affecting the snare. I've scooped out some of that problematic mid because this track has so many instruments fighting for that 300 hertz range, which you're going to find is a very frequent problem in mixing. So I've scooped a lot of that out because it wasn't really helping the drum set, but it was adding cloudiness to the track. I ended up doing the same thing with the bass for very similar reasons. The tone of the bass here, it's kind of flabby and indistinct, and by pulling some of this out, I was able to get clarity that was lacking. We'll talk about 6 and 2 in a minute, but you'll also notice I took the very bottom off of both of these tracks, just pulling out the lowest portions of it. I went a little lower with the kick drum because I just wanted to get rid of the very end of the room noise. I went a little higher with the bass because, well, we'll get back to that in a minute. That has a lot to do with the conversation we're going to do here. 4 over here is adding string noise. The bass string noise, I had to hunt for it. In fact, why don't we do that as an example? Let me get my bass going here.
And you.
So the bass sounded very thuddy to me. And I'm hearing that there's a little bit of string buzz in there, but it's barely coming through, and that string buzz is one of the distinctive sounds of an electric bass. So what I did was I enabled this point, I narrowed the Q, and then I really boosted it to listen for when I could hear the pop in the strings. There, I can hear a little bit of the buzz in the strings. There, that's a good spot right there. And then I just brought it down to a reasonable amount of boost, which for me was sitting in this ballpark. I forget exactly where it was. You can always rewind the video to look exactly where I had it earlier. And then widen the Q. Because of the way bass works, I wanted to make sure I captured enough of this frequency range to get a bunch of different strings. The lower you are, the less notes you affect with any given narrow band. You notice that frequencies start to get really distant the further up we go on the chart. I mean, down here, it's only a 50 jump from this whole area. Up here, we cover from 5K to 20K in the same space that we only get about 300 here. So it shows you how much we're capturing with a given boost. This just gave me a little bit more snarl in the sound of the bass, which I happen to really like. This is the bass without the EQ. It's not a bad sound. It's just a little dead, a little uninteresting. With the EQ, it's just got a little bit more personality. It's still a bit thuddy, but I think it's improved and there's more clarity because of this boost here. All right, now let's take a look at what we're actually doing with this strange thing going on between the 2 and 6 point here and the 2 and 3 point here. It's really the 2 point here, but the 2 and 6 point here for sure. Now, let's point out first the sound of the drum set without our EQ, and I'll turn off that so we don't have either EQ in at the moment, and this is just drums and bass. If we listen to the kick drum, boom, 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 boom. That sound and the bass are trying to fight for the same spot. Now, you don't have to be great at hearing that. What you need to notice is that it's actually a little hard to focus on either the bass or the kick without boosting something when you're listening to them both at the same time. So what we want to do is we want to make space for one or the other, so both of them can coexist together. The end result of this process will sound like this. Notice that the bass now is really easy to listen to on its own, and you can clearly hear the kick drum. Not to mention the kick drum's got a lot of body and presence now. So let's see exactly how we did that. So for our percussion patch, this 2 point should stick out to you. It's very, very high. Let's see where it is. I'm sitting at the 75 frequency range, so it's 75 hertz. Really good chunk of gains. 6 dB is a big, big boost. And then I've got a fairly narrow bandwidth, but you can see over here it's catching a decent amount of frequency. What's really going on here is I found the range that to me best affects the kick drum. Let me turn this off and on so we can hear it. That's off. And here's on. You notice the kick drum has weight to it now. There's a lot of oomph. And I found this just by hunting around. I grabbed this point, I slid it around until I could really feel the kick. Once I found that, I took note of the frequency range. It's about 75. So now the goal here is we don't want the bass to sit in that same range. So I used this this high pass filter, and I pulled it up fairly high to get the bass out of the way of that. The frequency range we're dealing with is right around here. You notice I've scooped it out. It's even started to pull some of that out. I could take this up even higher if I wanted to and really clear the space. But I didn't like what it did to the sound of the bass, so I'm gonna give it back some of that. I still want some bottom end in there. But now, we don't want the drum set to be in the way of the bass. So let's get that 6th point. I'm gonna disable that. Now right now, the drum set actually is very strong in the range where I decided to put the bass. I put the bass a little higher and emphasized it there. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a cut there just to create more space for the bass. And you hear how the bass comes forward when you do that? There's out. It's subtle. These are very subtle things. And now I'm pulling that range out of the kick. And it just leaves more room. The very bottom end of the bass now comes through beautifully. Okay, so here's the rule of thumb. At this early stage, your ears may not be recognizing these changes. They might be too subtle. So what I did was I found the personality of these two different instruments. And I said, okay, I think the kick sounds really good right around here. And I did that simply by boosting it and sliding it around until I felt the kick come forward and feel full. Then I took note of that and decided I'm going to move the bass to a slightly different range. Bass tends to be more versatile with this. I tend to be able to move bass around more. So I chose about 40 hertz above things, in the 130 range. It's almost 60 hertz above things. And I boosted it in that area and I moved it around again, looking for a spot higher than the kick that sounded really full and rich and brought the bass some life and presence. And then back to the drum set, I removed that frequency a comparable amount to leave space for it. So 6 here is designed to open up a hole for the bass. Is this making sense? This is the concept of unmasking. The idea here is that the bass was masked by the kick and the kick was masked by the bass. So by giving them distinctive regions, now these two instruments come forward. No EQ. Indistinct, taking up the same space, fighting for territory. EQ in. Little louder. That can fool the ear into thinking it's better. But notice how much easier it is now with the EQ to pay attention to the different instruments. Adding a little air brought those nice cymbals out. This boost right here brought out a personality in the snare. The snare's a little dead without it. With it, just a bit more pop. And then similar cuts in the 300 hertz range to add some space in a very muddy range of the track. All right, so that's enough for EQ for now. You can do lots and lots more. In fact, I encourage you to play around with anything to you that sounds like it's not really doing its job very well. Some tracks that are ripe for opportunity. There's 2 guitar parts in here that I haven't messed with yet. There's a horn section over here that to me sounds a little fizzy. So I might pull some of those sizzly signals out, probably up in the 3,000 or 4,000 hertz range. I might also look for mud in the trombone and tenor saxophone. They might have that down in the 300 range, and I might find that a tiny scoop down towards the bottom of that would help. I might also want a little bit of edge with warmth from them, which I might find around the 1,000 hertz range. So if you check out the EQ chart on the page that this video is on, it's got a lot of suggestions. These are just starting points. They're not rules of thumb, but they will get you close and they'll help guide your hand as you make tweaks. Just listen to the track, make some adjustments. You might find that the adjustments we've already made are enough, but if not, by all means play and see if you can continue to improve the sound of the track even more. All right, everybody, thank you.